This is a really important question, and I often think about how this shows, as much as any of the things that I teach on, how ethics intersects with pastoral care and other dimensions. So I remember back in my seminary days doing a research paper on in vitro fertilization and coming across this article that I can't remember much about what the article said, but the title said, Hannah prayed for a child. Today's couples seek infertility treatment. And I thought that was a rather abrupt way of looking at it, as though today's couples, Christian couples who do pursue fertility treatment, aren't also praying about it. And so it got me thinking about it. And the blessing of children is something that a significant percentage of couples, somewhere around 10 to 15%, are unable to realize because of infertility. And so the question is, how should we think about that? I mean, the Bible testifies not only that procreation is a wonderful gift and blessing from God, but also that childlessness is a burden that is so often difficult to bear. I mean, think of Proverbs 30, verse 16, that depicts the barren womb as something that is never satisfied. And this is not a picture of this couple that is discontent with what God has given them, but rather it's a picture, I think, of the deep desire that God has given us to have children, because it is a great blessing from Him. And so there's a great disappointment and burden that is born when we're unable to have children. One of the vivid portraits is of Rachel, who is loved greatly by her husband Jacob, and yet she's infertile. And she's burdened by this. And so she comes to Jacob and she says, "Give me children or I'll die." And this is just a picture of what infertility looks like and feels like. In fact, research has shown that it is next to cancer as causing great despair in the person who bears this. So infertility is a very difficult experience, and it leads many couples to consider the use of assisted reproductive technology, including in vitro fertilization, or IVF as I'll call it. So with IVF, an egg is taken from the mother and sperm from the father, and they're brought together in a petri dish in the laboratory in the hope that fertilization will occur. And if so, then the embryo is incubated for a short time and then transferred to the womb for implantation. And if all goes well, then they'll have a child by in vitro fertilization. So the question is whether it is okay for faithful Christian couples to pursue in vitro fertilization. And some are opposed to IVF out of principle. So some would argue against it because they believe that fertilization should only take place naturally inside the woman's body by means of intercourse between a husband and wife. Others are opposed because of the great cost of in vitro or other types of assisted reproductive technologies, and which can come into the thousands of dollars for each attempt. And so there are some concerns that people raise. Others, myself included, I would say, are not opposed to IVF in principle, but have concerns about the way that it is most often practiced. And so I would offer a couple of guidelines if a couple is to consider the use of in vitro fertilization. So the most important guidelines I would offer are these. First, if we think about one flesh in marriage, this means that we enjoy the blessings of marriage together, and we also deal with the burdens of marriage together. And so sometimes I think about how it'll be referred to as the husband who is infertile or the wife who is infertile. I think we ought not to think in those terms, but just think of it's the couple that's infertile. And sometimes the desperation for having a child, that is this desire to have a child of our own, is what many couples will say, will lead them to use a donor for sperm or a donor for egg or a surrogate. And yet, in reality, that's not a child of their own. It's his child or her child, but not their child in the biological sense. And that is meaningful. So I would caution first that based on one flesh in marriage, the couple should not go outside of their marriage to procure procreation. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is having to do with the treatment of embryos. Typically, in the use of IVF, what happens is excess embryos are created for efficiency, in effect. And if there's unhealthy embryos, they'll be discarded. Then the ones that will be used for implantation, they may take 1 or 2 or even up to 3. And if there's any excess, they'll be stored and frozen. In the United States, in fact, exact number is not known, but something over 500,000 embryos are in frozen storage. And a lot of times couples don't even return to use them because they've decided enough is enough, or in some cases, these cases appear in the news all the time, a couple may end up getting divorced and decide they don't want to use the spare embryos and so forth. I would simply caution a couple that if you do proceed with in vitro fertilization, that you should not create excess embryos because often these are lost. And so it means that you only fertilize the number of eggs that you need for implantation, which would be up to 2 probably as a maximum there. So those 2 basic principles, the one flesh principle and then the treatment of embryos, are important. The last thing I would say, that even if these things are followed, I would caution couples on this. Before they even were to pursue any form of reproductive technology, I think they ought to consider very carefully and prayerfully whether to proceed, not only because of the cost that is invested, but also because even with going forward with in vitro fertilization, the success rate is well under 50% for each round of treatment. And so couples need to think about the fact that even if they go through with this, they may not become pregnant. They may not have a child. And so ultimately, they need to think about what will they do if they remain childless. And this brings me back to the pastoral considerations, because couples who are going through this are going through a very difficult time and need the support of their family and friends and the church body. And in the end, they need to understand the promise of God. So in Isaiah 54, verse 1, knowing the burden of barrenness, Isaiah still says, "Sing, O barren one, you who have not borne a child." That's a remarkable thing to say. And it's because the good news is that Jesus will come. And so our hopes are not ultimately in having children, but we can rest in the promises of God and the blessing of the gospel, the good news that exceeds even the blessing of children.
Thanks for watching Honest Answers. You can submit your questions by email, Twitter, or in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to find out the answer to next Wednesday's question.